Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. From Boundary to Bear Lake, Fremont to Payette, Oahe to Oneida, there are interesting people, places, and histories in all of Idaho's counties. And Idaho Matters wants to share it with you with stories from all 44 counties that make up the Gem State. Email your ideas to idahomatters@boisestate.edu or use the Talk to Us feature in our app, available on Apple and Android, and tune in each weekday at noon for Idaho Matters. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters, and it's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We are going to get you updated on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, Kyle Fonenstill, reporter for Idaho Capital Sun, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, and Sydney Kidd, reporter with Boise Dev. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
And Kyle, let me start the conversation with you today. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. made a visit to Boise earlier this week. So what was the purpose of this visit?
So RFK Jr. was visiting Idaho to talk with state officials about his movement called MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again. And he was specifically hoping to celebrate Idaho's progress on that.
And Kyle, RFK Jr. actually praised Idaho's approach to medical freedom. What did he have to say about that?
He actually called Idaho the home of medical freedom. So this year, the legislature passed a big bill towards the end of the session that basically establishes a broad right to what they call medical freedom. The new law bans requirements for vaccines from government, businesses, and schools, and it bans them from turning people away if they haven't treated their sicknesses.
Okay, and he even praised Governor Little's handling of the pandemic. Tell us about that as well.
Yeah, so they only talked for a few minutes. He spent quite a bit of time critiquing COVID control measures during the Biden administration, but he did take a moment to call out Idaho as one of a few states that didn't cave in, and he said that Idaho did better in other states in preserving, quote, essential American freedoms, and he credited Governor Little's leadership for much of that. It's worth mentioning that during the early months of the pandemic, the governor limited public gatherings and closed some businesses. But when he ended those restrictions, he did refuse to issue a statewide mask mandate, even when hospitals were overwhelmed.
So, Kyle, did either Governor Little or RFK Jr. take questions from reporters during this brief interaction?
No, they didn't. It was only about 10 or 12 minutes or so. The governor signed this proclamation to make next month Keeping Idaho Healthy month. And that's just in place for August 2025. And during the event, there were a few protesters. So this was inside the governor's ceremonial office in the state capitol building, outside his office, and at the front steps of the Capitol, there were some protesters, and they had chants that were critical of RFK Jr.'s positions. You know, for a long time, he's critiqued vaccines as not being safe enough. And the federal government has recently restricted vaccine access in a number of ways that make it harder to get vaccines, and that some experts say don't really align with the scientific consensus around their safety.
All right. Well, appreciate that update, Kyle. Drew, a lawsuit regarding the city of McCall's short-term rentals got some more clarity this week. Before we get to what happened in court, can you tell us about this lawsuit?
Yeah, so this lawsuit was filed last year by a group of 5 short-term rental owners in the McCall area, who essentially felt that the city's regulations for short-term rentals that were adopted in 2022 went beyond what state law allows. If you don't know, state law, since 2017, has been that municipalities may only regulate short-term rentals with and here's that keyword, reasonable regulations for health and public safety. And so in 2022, The city's new regulations did a couple of things, including they established a new occupancy formula for short-term
Mm,
rentals. It'll be basically so if you have a four-bedroom home, you would count two people per bedroom plus two more overall, and that would be your occupancy. So you've got 10 right there with a four bedroom home. In addition to that, it established a new permitting process that included annual fire safety inspections. So this would involve an official from the local fire district coming in, checking out smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, combustible gas detectors, those sorts of things. But what we also found as those inspections got underway in 2024, that was the effective date for the new rules. That was the compliance date, if you will, when all short-term rentals had to come into compliance. And just to, I guess, put that into context, we're talking about roughly 400 short-term rentals in McCall city limits that these rules are applied to. But in any case, when those inspections started, they started looking at some of these bedrooms, and one of the things you have to have is proper egress. And some of these older homes, what they're finding is the windows were too small, and so the
mm.
bedroom either would not count, it would not be rentable, or the owners would have to upsize the windows in order to come into compliance. And so that's kind of the backdrop of why these owners felt that. The city's regulations kind of had the practical effect of restricting short-term rentals, which is precisely what that 2017 law says they can't do.
So then, Drew, what did Judge Scott rule on earlier this week?
It was almost a clean sweep for the city. There was one provision of the short-term rental regulations that McCall had in place that got thrown out related to noise, and that was a matter of kind of vague language that really would not be possible to meet, and so that got thrown out. Everything else was upheld. Judge Scott did not go with the short-term rental owners' arguments that it had the practical effect of limiting short-term rentals, because each of the owners said that they were still renting their properties and making money, perhaps less than they were before, but nonetheless, that avenue was still available to them. The other key argument that the owners made was that the city's regulations were unconstitutional and violated the Equal Protection Clause by essentially, regulating short-term rentals differently than long-term rentals.
Mm.
Judge Scott also disagreed with that, and he said, in fact, that 2017 law that I've mentioned a couple times, it invites differing regulations for short-term rentals and long-term rentals.
So, Drew, what kind of implications, if any, would the judge's decision have on, let's say, other cities in the state in terms of short-term rentals?
Well, this is kind of the first legal benchmark we have as far as, what is reasonable per that 2017 law. It had not really been tested in court before. There had not been a court ruling specifically on what constitutes a reasonable public health and safety regulation. And so this is that. This gives other cities a roadmap to say, well, hey, these regulations that McCall has, they were already upheld in court, so they can feel pretty good about instituting them in their jurisdictions.
How about any legislative implications from this ruling?
Yeah, this one's kind of interesting because obviously we don't know what might happen in the Idaho legislature from year to year, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
But what Judge Scott's ruling, it is very closely related to some of the arguments we've seen, particularly from Jordan Redmond of Coeur d'Alene, who in the past 2 years has pushed a couple bills forward, kind of targeting exactly the same provisions that the short-term rental owners in the lawsuit were targeting, basically seeking to further clarify that 2017 law to specifically, regulate short-term rentals and long-term rentals the same, and make that part of state code. So that's not to say that we won't see that again in the upcoming legislative session. But now, obviously, we've seen the courts weigh in on that. One other thing to note in all this is that, as is always the case in these legal processes, it's not final. The short-term rental owners, they have until towards the end of August to appeal this ruling to another court, and so
Mm.
we'll see if they do that. We don't know yet, but that's another thing to keep watching for.
All right. Appreciate that update, Drew. So, Kyle, results of a new poll make it quite clear on how Idahoans feel about public lands. Can you begin by reminding us about the federal push to privatize public lands?
Yeah, so the big beautiful bill that recently became law changed a good bit along the way. Early on, as I'm sure some folks remember, there was a provision of it in it from Utah's U.S. Senator Mike Lee to sell off many public lands. In the West, a lot of people were very opposed to it. Several of Idaho's congressmen were too. In the end, that provision didn't end up in the final bill that passed. But in Idaho, it would have had big implications. More than 60% of land is public, and this poll delved into how people feel about that and put some specific numbers to it.
Okay, so there has been pushback since there was this federal proposal to do all of this, Kyle. So tell us about this poll and who conducted it.
Yeah, so this poll at a high level shows that 96% of Idaho registered voters believe public lands should stay in public hands. This poll was paid for by Conservation Voters of Idaho, and like all polls, it's worth noting that the exact numbers that are reported might not be exactly how people feel about this. It has a margin of
Mhm.
error of plus or minus 3.2%. So that's the range of how much poll results might be different than what the public actually believes.
Okay, but with that said, Kyle, even if you know that plus or minus, right? That means even if you go on the low end of that, it's around 91, 92% of Idahoans who believe that, public lands stay in public hands. With that, what was the major takeaway that folks should know about in regards to this poll?
Yeah, so even if you account for some kind of marginal differences in how people feel about
Hmm.
it, the big takeaway is that the vast majority of Idahoans want public lands to stay public. It really interesting that it's bipartisan too. So when you break down that 96% figure between just Democrats and Republicans, it's 97% of Democrats want public lands to stay public, and 95% of Republicans do too. And
Mm.
the poll also asked about the 2026 election since that's coming up. So when the poll told voters about Idaho U.S. Senator Jim Risch's opposition to the public lands sell-off proposal, support for him jumped by 10%, and he'll be up for re-election in 2026.
Okay, good takeaways there. So, Drew, a decision has been made in regards to using chemicals in Payette Lake. Can you start by telling us about the issue with the lake?
So we're talking about invasive species here, specifically Eurasian water milfoil. It was found in Payette Lake in the late 90s, and then ever since 2001, there have been various efforts to basically keep the infestation under control. For a long time, that program was headed up by Valley County. In 2022, it switched over to the State Department of Agriculture. And essentially, the debate is, that since the state took over, the infestation has grown. It's roughly doubled in size from about 77 acres to somewhere in the neighborhood of 183 acres. That's as of last year. We don't have the current figures for 2025. But it's effectively grown to the point that ISDA says that this milfoil has formed kind of a bathtub ring, if you will, around the
Hmm.
entire shoreline of Payette Lake. Milfoil grows in that shoreline zone. It's roughly the first 30 feet or so that you might see it. It will only grow in those areas where sunlight penetrates. And if
Mm.
left unchecked over time, it essentially chokes everything else out because there's no natural predators for it here in Idaho. It will actually penetrate the surface of the water and form kind of big lumpy mats of the vine all tangled up, and
Mm.
it'll choke out whole areas of the lake, and render them inaccessible by boat, because they'll just get tangled up in all those weeds.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so that's kind of the issue at hand. And with that expansion that they've seen in the last couple years, that increased growth of the infestation, ISDA had wanted to come in and do a herbicide treatment on the lake for the first time. It
Hmm.
would have started with a smaller test area, and then in future years followed up with larger acreages to basically get the problem back under control. Um, that decision was unpopular with locals, we'll just say.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that because locals have some real concerns about this and the impact on the lake. So what have they been saying?
Well, I think a large part of it is simply that, the word herbicide doesn't make a lot of people feel particularly warm and fuzzy. Particularly when Payette Lake, it's the source of the city's drinking water. There's two water intakes in that lake that it pumps water to the treatment plant and then directly to homes and businesses across McCall. And so, the thought of deliberately putting chemicals in that water source, for a lot of people, that's a non-starter right up front. The other side of it is, there's concern that essentially you've got these large swaths of really dense milfoil that is grown, and if you apply a herbicide to it and it kind of dies off en masse, what's that going to mean? What's that going to do as far as causing other water quality issues in the lake, particularly um, as it relates to phosphorus, which can fuel toxic blue-green algae blooms. We've had problems here in Valley County with that in recent years. Obviously, there's been numerous others across the state, especially in northern Idaho, for the last couple decades. And so there's concern that, well, okay, if we get the milfoil problem under control, are we just creating other problems?
Well, and it's interesting in your report about this, Drew, was that other states have had mixed results from only using herbicidal treatments. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And that's something kind of key to note as well. Like there's 48 milfoil has been found in 48 states in the US. Only Wyoming and Hawaii does not have known populations of milfoil. So it's very common. This is not a new problem. That's unique to Payette Lake in any kind of way. This is happening almost everywhere across the country. Here in Idaho, I can tell you up in Hayden Lake, which has received several herbicide treatments over the years, they also looked into this exact concern that I was just talking about relative to phosphorus loading, where you have these, you apply the herbicide and then you've got all these dead plants that are decaying in the lake and releasing phosphorus. And what's that going to do as far as causing other water quality issues? The Hayden Lake Water Quality Association took a look at that, and they did essentially find that there was no tangible impact by the herbicide use as far as phosphorus loading. The release of phosphorus from the decaying plants was slow enough that it didn't cause a spike. It didn't seem to create conditions that would be conducive to uh, producing a blue-green algae bloom. So that was
Hmm.
one interesting study from elsewhere. One of the more interesting ones, though, that I found actually came out of Wisconsin. This was an 11-year long study, so quite a large sample size, and they followed 28 lakes, some of which about half were treated with herbicides for milfoil, the other half were not. And they did generally find that these treatments were effective at curbing infestation. Um, but interestingly enough, the lakes that weren't treated did not necessarily just spiral into total infestation and kind of become subject to those extremes that I mentioned earlier, where you've got, matted up weeds on the surface and other water quality problems. It kind of in some cases remained, I shouldn't say stagnant, but it didn't get out of control anyway. And so with that, it suggests that, you're not necessarily doomed without herbicide use. Um,
Hmm.
And so that brings us to the state's decision, which was, they with all the public opposition and heartache over this treatment, which was set to be right around this time or maybe early in August, that they would just put a pin in it and revisit next year. So there will be no milfoil removal on Payette Lake this year, either by mechanical harvest, which is what has typically been used. It's almost like a underwater vacuum cleaner that sucks all these plants up and gets them out of the lake. And that's, I suppose, one of the key things to understand is this milfoil. It is quite prolific. It propagates really fast because anytime it breaks that fragment of the plant, it drifts off someplace, it settles, and then it grows there. So every single
Hmm.
time it's broken up, it produces a new plant. And that's kind of why we're here today.
All right. So, Kyle, Idaho is going to be seeing some impacts from the recently passed, quote, big, beautiful bill. Can we begin with Medicaid? What do these cuts mean for Idaho?
Yeah. So Gemma, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'll only get
Yeah.
to some of it. And of course, there's a big, complicated bill that we'll learn a lot about more over time. But for starters, all states could be facing some really difficult decisions around these Medicaid cuts about what to do with the program. That's because Medicaid is mostly funded by the federal government. States pay big chunks already, but this bill could mean less help from the feds in a few ways. So in Idaho, overall, the bill is expected to cut federal funds for Medicaid by $4.3 billion dollars over the next decade. And at the same time, it could cut enrollment by up to 40,000 people. There's around some 300,000 people enrolled in Medicaid at any given time in Idaho. But so these cuts are expected to happen partly because of the new nationwide Medicaid work requirements. They could cut the number of people on the program. But another way that this impacts Idaho is this bill caps how much states can tax providers like hospitals. This is the kind of wonky part of how Medicaid is funded. So states basically use these taxes on medical providers like hospitals to get extra Medicaid funds from the federal government. So and just to state again, this bill is really complicated, and how it could impact Idaho and other states will become
Hmm.
clearer in the days to come.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, it's highly complicated, and we're only quickly touching on a couple of things today with this. So, the other one I wanted to talk about, Kyle, are SNAP benefits. So, can you quickly explain what those benefits are and then the impact?
So this is also kind of complicated. So SNAP is mostly funded by the federal government. It's a little different. So the feds pay for benefits, all benefit costs historically. Like that's the money that goes to low income people to buy food. But states already pay half the cost to run the program. So the way that Idaho is going to be impacted is this bill will raise states' costs to run the program up from the half that they currently pay to 75% of cost. And Idaho, that translates to the state being on the hook to pay another $6 million dollars each year. Other states might
Okay.
have to
Okay.
pay even more under another part of the bill that shifts benefit costs on the states. But for now, Idaho's in the clear because we have one of the lowest payment error rates in the nation, in the country for SNAP.
Hmm. Okay. Appreciate that update, Kyle. Ruth, I want to turn to you now. More than 3,000 Idahoans with disabilities are waiting for vocational rehabilitation services from the state. Can you start by telling us what these services are?
Sure, thanks, Gemma. So the number is actually 3,005, but in my story I put more than 3,000 just to give a nice round number.
Yeah.
It's 3,005 Idahoans with disabilities are waiting for vocational rehabilitation. Um, Vocational rehabilitation is their mission is to prepare individuals with disabilities for employment and career opportunities while meeting the needs of the employer. So they use job counselors and training and education to partner people with jobs that they can maintain and help them maintain employment with a disability. And whatever that looks like, whatever their um, abilities are, and as well as uh, teaching them to advocate for themselves. Folks with disabilities, of course, are entitled to certain rights, and self-advocacy is uh, is a big part of that. And so they work on
Hmm.
that. The division serves both adults and high school students who are nearing graduation. Those students coming out will be going into the workforce, and they need to know their rights, and they need to understand that they uh, can have accommodations, that kind of thing. And so Voc Rehab assists with all
Mhm.
of that. And right now they have quite a wait list for those individuals.
And my understanding, Ruth, is they have a wait list because they've been having financial difficulties. So how has that played into this issue?
Correct. So in 2024, the budgeting issues came to light. And they came to light during the legislative session. The division had been paying, essentially, they'd been paying for more services than its budget could cover. And so the legislature had to give them some additional supplemental appropriations to cover that. Um, we don't have the exact number, but the division had been paying um, essentially been paying for services that they could not cover maybe from prior fiscal years, um,
Mm.
somewhere to the tune of around $2.7 million. And so they're working their way out of that. On Tuesday, I did watch the Idaho Division, or excuse me, the Idaho State Rehabilitation Council meeting. They're the council that is made up of members who um, participate in Voc Rehab and are
Hmm.
invested in Voc Rehab. They're stakeholders, and working their way out of that. And their interim administrator, Judy Taylor, was quite hopeful that they're not quite at the dire financial cliff that they were at one point, and she's hoping that they will be able to serve some of the waitlisted individuals, especially those with the most significant disabilities, this
Mm.
calendar year.
All right. Appreciate that update, Ruth. Sydney, can you talk to us about a split decision in Meridian about city council and mayor raises? And let's start with city council raises. What did the council decide and
Yeah,
why?
so this week the Meridian City Council elected to forego raises for the next 2 years.
And what was their reasoning behind foregoing those raises? Did they give any?
Yeah, so I mean it was a split decision. The council kind of went back and forth about it. Those that were in favor of the raises said that they were doing it because they wanted to um keep the positions appealing. City council is a part-time job. Um,
Hmm.
so they do get compensated a little bit. But they wanted to keep it as a position that would be relatively appealing, and something that, maybe people who are at busier times of their life could still do. But then on the flip side, those that were maybe against the raises said that they were worried about what the messaging of them getting raises would send to the public when
Mm.
they're about to ask them to do a public safety levy this fall. I guess they haven't decided on the public safety levy. They'll
Uh-huh.
decide that on Tuesday, but they didn't feel right about taking a raise when that's a possibility that's on the table.
Okay, but they did agree on raises for the mayor, two raises. So what did they have to say about foregoing raises for the council, but not for the mayor?
Yeah, so there wasn't a whole lot of discussion around the mayor's raise. I feel like most of the discussion happened when they were talking about the council raises. Um, there, the reason why the mayor's raises passed was because one council member, Brian Whitlock, he changed his vote. He voted against the council raises, but he voted in favor of the mayoral raise. And so that
Mm.
was just the little tip that got it to pass.
So, Drew, an Australian mining company just got the green light to start drilling for gold near Yellow Pine. Tell us about this decision.
Yeah, so Resolution Minerals was approved by the Boise National Forest to begin exploration on a 22 square mile project zone that's uh, basically spitting distance from Yellow Pine, right there, less than a mile from downtown Yellow Pine, if you will. Um, So that work, it's only a year of work. We're talking roughly 20 drill holes. And it could start as soon as this summer, but it could also be pushed off to next summer. That just depends on the company's lead times and things like that.
Hmm. So, Drew, what does this exploration involve? Because you said it was
Well,
only going to be about a year.
the, Yeah, these boreholes there'd be about 20 of them in this first phase. They'd go up to 1,000 feet deep, and what they're doing is extracting core samples, looking for a couple different minerals, really, obviously gold, and then antimony and tungsten as well. This is another site in that yellow pine area that has been historically mined. It's produced antimony and tungsten in the past. Um,
Hmm.
and so and I guess let's put this in perspective a little bit more. This is a project site that borders Perpetua Resources Stibnite Mine. The Horse Heaven project, as this one is known, shares its western boundary with Perpetua's eastern boundary. So this is in some ways a continuation of all the mineral activity in that area, albeit two different companies. Now, another thing to kind of keep in context here, this is very, very preliminary work. Perpetua, for its Stibnite project, which was just approved earlier this year, they drilled 390 boreholes with
Mm.
an exploration package that started in 2009. They were not ready to submit a mining plan until 2016. So even with this drilling going on and this obvious interest by Resolution um, to potentially develop another mine in the Yellow Pine area, we would be years away at a minimum before we'd see
Okay.
a proper mining plan.
All right. Appreciate that, Drew. Kyle, Idaho's Division of Human Resources has a new chat bot. It's powered by AI, and it's supposed to help answer questions about state agencies. So, can you tell us just a bit about this new service?
Yeah, so Gemma, this chatbot is on their website for anybody to use. Just click a little chat bubble on the bottom right corner. So it
Hmm.
combs through state government websites to get people quick answers to questions. You can think of it like
Okay.
some things you might already use, like ChatGPT, but just for state government.
Okay, so you actually went into this chat bot and you asked them a question about state employees. I found this fascinating, Kyle. Tell us about this because you got an answer that didn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so we learned that Idaho was preparing to roll out much more AI to state government agencies. They're going to need some guidance about how to use it. So we found this tool. We wanted to test it. So we asked it, how many state employees does Idaho have? The answer was totally wrong. It falsely claimed that like a third of Idaho's over 2 million population works for the state. So
Oh,
so we circled back with the agency and so like how do we make sense of this? How accurate is this information? And so the Idaho HR chief suggested wording the question a little differently. We should have asked it how many active state employees they are. And when you ask it
hmm.
that, it's much more accurate. It says Idaho has over 23,000 state employees. And, a lot of people who already use AI chatbots probably already know this, but I think this is a good learning lesson and how you ask the question really matters.
Well, I think you're totally right with that, Kyle. But as we know, a lot of people are not familiar with AI and chatbots. And that's also why I think sometimes they get these bad reputations, right? So I'm asking that because, as you mentioned, they have plans to roll out more AI services. So, um, do they have an actual plan to do this? I mean, um, because they're going to be rolling more out in the next couple of months, right? So, is there kind of a way to do this to make sure that it's the majority of the information is accurate or will over the next couple of years?
Yes, they do have a plan. It's from the Idaho Office of Information Technology. We saw a draft of the plan. They were going to share it with state agencies, and it was like
Hmm.
84 pages long, super in depth about how to do this responsibly, make sure the information is accurate, and make sure your data is safe. And it's a multi-step plan over 2 years. It's going to start with setting up foundations, like how do we oversee AI? Then pilot programs launch, like this Division of Human Resources chatbot, and then a broader rollout, and of course, there's going to be a lot of refining things along the way. So in short, by August, state officials expect state governments to start using publicly available tools like ChatGPT or Gemini and chatbots like the one we just talked about. State agencies have mostly been blocked from doing that, with a few exceptions like we talk about in our story.
Hmm.
DMV is another agency testing a chatbot, but right now it's just internal testing, and they're trying to make sure it's accurate. And there's no personally identifiable information in there, just stuff like laws and policies. So DMV agents can be quicker to answer questions from the public.
Well, like it or hate it, I think it's, where the future is headed, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how all of this rolls out, Kyle. So thanks for that update. And folks, you should read Kyle's story if you want to go more in depth on it. It's really interesting. So, Drew, there is a quite remarkable story out of McCall that highlights the need for more folks to know CPR, but also how AEDs are saving more lives. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so this was a pretty inspiring story to work on. It involves the Shore Lodge banquet manager, Christian Kwarm. On the morning of June 19th, he was setting up for a banquet at Shore Lodge and shuffling supplies around and a storage closet to get to, the particular chairs that he needed to be able to pull out for this banquet. And he's, kind of hustling and making things happen. And he just kind of starts feeling as though he's having a panic attack. He can't seem to catch his breath, and he uh, does some breathing exercises that he routinely has used to help himself calm down in the past during panic attacks, and it doesn't seem to be working. And finally, he tells his coworker, like, "Hey, I think you need to call 911. Like, I don't know, something's not right." And that's
Hmm.
where it goes black. He passes out, he collapses. Um, there was some attendees in a nearby banquet that was going on at the time that heard the commotion, heard screaming and yelling, and they came over and they started immediately doing CPR. Uh, a McCall police officer was a minute away. He got there within a minute and administered an AED shock to Christian to kind of reset that clock while waiting on medical personnel to arrive. He was shocked
Hmm.
again 5 minutes later when medical personnel did arrive and eventually kind of came to and they were able to stabilize him right there at Shore Lodge and he was eventually flown out down to Boise and got some stents and made a full recovery. So about 3 weeks after that incident, McCall Fire and EMS, which they're the agency that responded to that incident, they were leading a CPR class at Shore Lodge. Firefighter paramedic Danielle Desmond was kind of in charge of all that. And she was surprised that morning of the class to look out, and there's like maybe a dozen people attending this thing. And one of them is Christian, who
Mm.
she had just done CPR on a few weeks earlier. He had made a full recovery in those 3 weeks, and that was actually his first day back at work, was to go for that
Oh.
CPR class. He felt like it was the right thing to do and wanted to be sure that, he would be in position to kind of return the favor to those who helped save his life on June 19th. It's remarkably rare for people who have heart attacks outside of a hospital setting to survive. And in Christian's case, he had a widowmaker heart attack, which
Yeah.
makes it even more. He had a near 50% functional blockage in his heart. And the American Heart Association estimates that something like 10%, fewer than 10% of patients who have heart attacks outside of a hospital survive. However, that rate does increase, they can double or triple if immediate CPR is administered.
Mm.
Um, and so it's one of those stories that, you think about paying it forward. And that's what comes to mind for me with Christian, where, he had taken a CPR class before 15 years earlier, but he has this experience and he just immediately, you talk about accountability, like as soon as I'm better, I'm gonna go, brush up on my CPR so that I can be in position to help is pretty inspiring.
Absolutely. I agree with you. So, Drew, have the skis come down off that roof of McCall yet? Because last we checked in with you, the skis were still up.
The skis are down. They've been down for about maybe a little over a month now, as of June, certainly.
So, remind us about this controversy.
Well, it goes back to 2023. The owner of the Lake Town Clothing Company right there in downtown McCall, it's at the corner of Lenora and First Streets, put up this decorative water ski roofing, but he did so without permission from the city. And the city caught wind of it and initiated a review process and ultimately found that it did not comply with city design standards, particularly the bright and vibrant contrasting colors of the water skis were they conflicted with the city's standards for building material colors. And so there was an appeal process that went through the Planning and Zoning Commission, went to City Council. There was a lot of support for this water ski roof, but ultimately the planning bodies agreed with the city staff interpretation that while it might be nice, there is no avenue for this in city code. And so it was shut down with promise that, we'll revisit this someday because this is something that we'd like to see. And apparently, there's been hundreds and hundreds of public comments in support of these water skis. It's received quite a bit of community support. So then that after that whole ordeal in 2023, earlier this year, the owner of the business put the skis back up because there'd been no movement, and we kind of went through the same thing all over again. And he took the skis down, but basically shined a spotlight again on the issue of, hey, when are we gonna take a look at that city code and see if we can make some updates? The last I've seen on that, and this was just a couple days ago, I was perusing the McCall City Council's meeting packets. There is a topic on the to be scheduled list to discuss potential changes or to discuss the process involved. So it's at least on the radar. It's not scheduled at this point, but it's movement, I suppose.
I guess so, right? So, Sydney, tell us about the closing of the original Sunrise Cafe on Fairview in Boise, because this is just one more shuttering of a number of restaurants run by Boomer Godsill. So, remind us real quickly why some of his other restaurants had to close.
Yeah, so we reported on this, I believe it was last year. There were a few restaurants of his that had to close, like Huck House Brunchette, as well as both Biscuit and Hogs locations. Each of those ended with evictions, the classic locked out of the restaurant situation. And when you looked through the court records, you found that he owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in both unpaid rent as well as unpaid vendor fees.
Okay, so any word now on what will happen to the building that Sunrise occupied?
Yeah, so we reached out to the property owner. He said that Sunrise and him had come to a mutual agreement that the restaurant would move out of the property. Right now, if you go by, there's caution tape up everywhere. There's furniture from the restaurant that's out on the back deck, and he says he's doing a full renovation and he's getting ready to have a fresh look for the restaurant because he's got a new restaurant that plans to move into the property. He said if everything goes well, it should be another breakfast and lunch restaurant.
Okay, but no word on what that restaurant will be or who would be running it.
No, not yet. The only thing that he said he was able to tell us was that the person had worked in the restaurant industry for years, but that this would be their first restaurant.
All right. Well, I appreciate all of you so much. Thank you to our panelists today, Drew Dodson with the Valley Lookout, Kyle Fonan still with Idaho Capital Sun, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports, and Sydney Kidd with Boise Dev. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.